Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
My family flew to Hawaii for Christmas without me, not by accident or overbooking or some fragile miscommunication that could be softened with a voicemail and a shrug, but by design and with a text from my sister Ashley that said it would be simpler if I stayed home, a short sentence dressed as logistics that felt like someone reached into my chest and rearranged the furniture. And the part that made me laugh out loud in the empty kitchen was that she typed it from the spare bedroom down the hall because she and her husband Dylan had been living in my house rent-free since last spring while they got back on their feet, which was my mother's phrase whenever Ashley wanted something and my father's phrase when he needed to pretend it was temporary. I have learned that betrayal never arrives as a dramatic crash with sirens and smoke. It shows up in small planned errands disguised as concern. It borrows your spare keys and moves its suitcase in while you are busy being reasonable. And for years I told myself that keeping the peace was grown up, that covering utilities and groceries for a couple who could quote wine notes, but somehow could not quite manage rent was generous rather than ridiculous, that missing invitations to family brunches was an oversight rather than a pattern, and if I heard the word sensitive one more time I was going to stitch it onto a pillow and gift it to my mother Margaret so she would have something honest to display in the living room. Ashley framed the Hawaii trip as an adult reset, a family healing, a time for the successful ones to exhale and plan the new year, which slid past me like an oily joke because I am the one with a mortgage, a business that pays its taxes on time, and a pantry that stays full without a group chat, yet somehow I am the complication, the bad vibe, the person whose questions about budgets and boundaries turn holiday cocktails into courtroom exhibits, and if I sound bitter it is because I am, but it is the good kind, the kind that keeps you awake the night before a storm and forces you to tape the windows even if someone calls you dramatic. I made coffee, the strong kind that puts hair on your feelings, and I opened the group thread that could have planned a moon landing but somehow forgot to include me. And I scrolled through the confirmations for oceanfront suites and snorkeling packages, and those matching shirts that make adults look like they are auditioning for a family newsletter, and I let the sting burn through. Because sometimes you have to let the match catch before you blow it out, and then I did something that felt like stepping onto a floor I had installed years ago without admitting that I would one day need it. I opened my email and pulled up the month-to-month use agreement I had drafted when Ashley moved in. The one everyone said was unnecessary because we're family. The one I kept anyway because I am not stupid, just patient. The words looked back at me like a spine I had mislaid, clear and lawful and boring in the best possible way, and while my sister posted boomerangs from an airport bar and my mother sent duck-lip selfies to the family thread like she was 18 again, I printed the notice to vacate, signed it in ink that does not apologize, and slid it into a folder along with a neatly typed inventory of their belongings, the ones they had scattered through my house like breadcrumbs with no intention of picking them up, and I realized that generosity without boundaries is just a clearance sale on your self-respect. The first call came from my father Tom, who leaves long messages that sound like weather reports, measured fronts of guilt moving in from the west, and he used phrases like holiday spirit and be the bigger person, which is interesting when you think about who pays for the roof, who replaces the furnace filters, who buys the toilet paper that vanishes like it is part of a science experiment, and I let it go to voicemail, because I wanted the record, not the argument. And because I had work to do that did not include comforting a man who had never once asked if I felt welcome. I opened Ashley's door with the same key I had handed her the day she arrived with a tearful speech about temporary rough patches, and I looked at the vacation suitcase she left open on the bed like a postcard to herself. And I started packing the rest of her life with the kind of care she had never used on mine, folding dresses, wrapping perfume bottles, stacking Dylan's gaming equipment that hummed through 3 a.m. like an insect that never sleeps. And with every drawer I closed I felt something else close too, something old that had been left ajar in case anyone ever wanted to walk through it and meet me where I lived. A petty part of me wanted to toss everything into trash bags and dump them on the lawn just to watch their faces, but a better part of me, the part that understands what real revenge tastes like, chose order and documentation and a moving company that does not ask questions when you say the words storage unit, and by the time their plane cleared the coastline, I had labeled boxes by room, photographed each stack, scheduled a locksmith for the afternoon they were due to land, and set up mail. Forwarding for anything addressed to them, because I am generous, not stupid, and I prefer my victories clean. When my mother's second call came through with the special ringtone she assigned herself, I let it ring long enough to taste the old reflex, the one that would have had me apologizing for making other people uncomfortable in my own home. And then I pressed decline and stared at the quiet rectangle of the phone like it was an aquarium finally cleared of cloudy water, and I realized the house sounded different without the constant buzz of someone else's needs. By the time the movers rolled the last box down the hallway, I had left the envelope with the notice to vacate and a copy of the key policy on the kitchen island beside a neat little stack of their mail. And I placed the spare keys they never returned in a shallow dish like artifacts from a civilization that had mistaken hospitality for free rent, and when the driver asked if I wanted to insure the storage unit contents, I said yes, because my sister has always believed that nothing bad happens to her, and sometimes the only way to teach a lesson is to make sure it happens on paper first. Outside, the locksmith then pulled to the curb with the cheerful punctuality of a new chapter, and as I signed the work order I caught my reflection in the storm door, not heroic and not cruel. Just a woman who had finally decided that if her family insisted on treating her like a complication, then she could be a very organized one, and I told myself that when Ashley landed and called me with whatever fresh script my mother had rehearsed with her, I would not yell, I would not cry, I would simply point her to the storage unit address and the folder on the counter and the calendar date circled in red ink, and then I would hang up and let the silence do the heavy lifting, because silence, used properly, is a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet. Their plane was due to land before dinner, the locks would be changed before sunset, and the house, for the first time in months, smelled like my coffee and my soap and my choices. And while the Christmas lights blinked across the street on families that did not require disclaimers, I stood in my hallway with the new keys cooling in my palm and listened to the front door click into its new voice. And that is when my phone lit up with Ashley's name and an incoming video call from the baggage claim, and I let it ring until it stopped, because I wanted the next sound to be her hands on a door that no longer belonged to her. They arrived in matching airport leis that looked like they had been harvested from a plastic factory at dawn, rolling shiny suitcases through the driveway with the triumphant energy of people who mistake other people's patience for a renewable resource. And when Ashley pressed the code on the keypad and watched the porch light blink yellow instead of green, she went very still, the way a cat freezes before it decides whether to pounce or pretend it never wanted the bird in the first place. While Dylan performed a small monologue about faulty electronics that might have landed if the doormat had not already been rolled to expose the absence of their old spare key, which I had retired with the same ceremony I reserve for expired milk and men who confuse confidence with volume. I opened the door before they could start knocking like trick-or-treaters who missed the memo, and the look on Ashley's face as she took in the movers' scuffs on the entryway, the tidied absence of their shoes, the neat stack of mail with her name redirected, was a study in the moment a person realizes the stage crew has struck the set, and she skipped the pleasantries and went straight to outrage, asking what kind of person changes locks at Christmas, and I said the kind who pays for the locks. In January, February, March, and every month after that, while the house hosts people who believe the word temporary has no calendar attached to it. And Dylan tried to step around me on a tide of cologne and entitlement until he saw the envelope on the console table addressed to them with my laminated smile beside it like a notary public in a black dress. I did not raise my voice because I've learned that volume is a poor substitute for infrastructure, and infrastructure is exactly what I had built over the past 48 hours, so I invited them to the porch instead, pointed to the potted rosemary that had finally recovered from Dylan's idea of gardening, and handed Ashley the notice to vacate with the precise politeness I reserve for contracts and casseroles, explaining that their belongings were secured in a climate-controlled storage unit with a padlock code that would be texted upon acknowledgement, that utilities formerly abused like an all-you-can-eat buffet were now in my name alone. and that any attempt to re-enter without permission would be treated as the thing it actually was rather than the thing family calls it when family wants a discount. Ashley read the first paragraph and launched into the old choreography, the steps choreographed by our mother and refined in the family living room over decades, where she plays misunderstood visionary and I play the hard-edged accountant who refuses to understand art, and she said words like sabotage and jealousy and holiday cruelty, while Dylan, who has never met a passive income video he didn't like, muttered about tenants' rights in the tone of a man quoting a blog he skimmed during a layover, and I said that month-to-month agreements are like houseplants, they die when ignored, and that mine, unlike their basil, had been watered with documentation, and then I pointed to the line with the move-out date circled in calm black ink that said 1 week, which is generous when you consider that I was given 0 days to prepare for being written out of a family vacation I would have declined anyway on principle, but accepted on curiosity. The performance swelled with the arrival of my parents, summoned by a group text I watched populate like a weather radar, and my mother swept up the walkway carrying grievance the way other women carry handbags, insisting that I was overreacting and that no one meant to hurt me, which is an interesting defense considering intention is the blanket people throw over the cold to make themselves feel better about leaving the window open, while my father cleared his throat in the preamble style that has introduced every disappointing conversation since I learned how to spell, suggesting that perhaps we could all share the house for a few more weeks while they transitioned, and I smiled at the word because if there is anything I believe should be swift, it is the transit of people who do not pay rent out of the houses they do not own. I walked them through the porch terms like a flight attendant who knows exactly how many life vests are stored under the seats, explaining that their boxes were labeled by room and photographed for inventory, that the storage unit fee was paid through the end of the month as a courtesy, that any furniture they had claimed as heirloom had been carefully wrapped and documented despite my suspicion that at least one antique side table was an enthusiastic contribution from a discount warehouse, and that while I was perfectly willing to be humane, I was retired from being a doormat, and my mother tried a softer tactic then, the one where she takes my hand and calls me by my childhood nickname as if a diminutive could shrink a boundary. And she said we needed to talk privately, woman to woman, which I declined because we have done that talk and it always ends with me apologizing for an atmosphere. Dylan tried a new angle and asked if they could at least come in to repack a few things they couldn't live without, and I gestured to the 2 overnight bags I had assembled with the precision of a nurse preparing a discharge kit, including medication, chargers, and the kind of plain t-shirts no one photographs, and I added a printed list of the storage unit contents with asterisks next to items they had repeatedly borrowed from me as if repetition turned taking into tradition, and when Ashley scoffed that I was being dramatic, I said that organization only looks dramatic to people who prefer chaos, and then I told them the part that made even my father stop playing referee and look at me as if he had underestimated the size of the field. If they vacated by the date listed, the storage unit and a month's basic expenses were covered by me as a goodbye gift, because I believe in clean exits, but if they attempted to stay, re-enter, or turn this porch summit into a long-running saga that endangered my peace, then starting the following morning I would begin invoicing them at market rent retroactive to last spring. Not because I needed the money, but because sometimes the only language people hear is the one with numbers and late fees. And at the first sign of a dispute, I would let the paperwork do what my politeness had failed to accomplish, and I watched the math march across Dylan's eyes like clouds leaving a sunburn behind. My mother opened her mouth to tell me I was tearing the family apart, and I said the family has been held together with my goodwill and my mortgage, which is a kind of glue that hardens when ignored, and then I stepped backward into my foyer, set the overnight bags on the threshold like peace offerings at the temple of adulthood, and closed the door with a measured gentleness that felt both surgical and merciful, locking it while their voices rose into the winter air, and I leaned my forehead against the cool wood for a breath I had owed myself for years and smiled despite the ache, because in the drawer of the console table where I keep tax receipts and spare batteries lay the one document everyone kept pretending was theoretical. The quiet sheet of paper that decided every argument before it began, the thing they could not charm, guilt, or out-talk, the thing I would let speak next if they pushed me even an inch further. The deed. The first day without their footsteps was so startlingly calm that even the refrigerator sounded thoughtful, a low steady hum instead of the jittery rattle it had adopted after months of midnight raids for sparkling water and leftover takeout, and I realized, somewhere between brewing coffee strong enough to tan leather and answering emails with a level of focus I had not felt since early spring, that silence, when you have earned it, is not emptiness, but a room finally cleared of borrowed furniture, and into that room I carried every small thing I had postponed while trying not to be the villain in a story other people were writing about me without asking for my notes. The calls began before noon, a parade of missed connections stacked like plates in the sink after a party you never attended, my mother leading with a voice message that started in outrage and softened into a familiar sigh about family unity and holiday spirit. My father following with a slow-weather report of disappointment wrapped in paternal baritone, and then cousins and an aunt or two who had somehow heard a version of events where I had evicted a pregnant orphan during a snowstorm despite the facts that Ashley is neither pregnant nor an orphan, and the only snow in the forecast was the decorative kind piped into a mall atrium 60 kilometers away. And because I know the power of the narrative that lands first, I did something deeply unglamorous, but very effective, which is how most adult solutions look when you peel off the drama. I wrote a short, factual message and sent it to the family thread, the one that usually announces potlucks and photo dumps, and I kept it clean, chronological, and boring on purpose. I explained that Ashley and Dylan had lived in my home rent-free for over a year with utilities and groceries covered, that the month-to-month agreement signed at move-in outlined courtesy expectations and a 30-day horizon for either party, that a formal notice to vacate had been served with a clear one-week grace period because I am capable of being both firm and kind, that their belongings were packed, photographed, and placed in a climate-controlled storage unit prepaid through the end of the month, and that any further discussion should be dignified and directed to me privately rather than in a rolling spectacle of half-truths. And then I added the one sentence that tasted like a square of dark chocolate on my tongue. In the interest of everyone's peace, I would not be taking calls for 48 hours, but I would happily read messages and respond in writing as needed, which is adult for please stop performing and start articulating. The immediate replies were a collage of shock, accusation, and the occasional quietly supportive thumbs up that fluttered in from relatives who have practiced minding their own business as a sacred art. And while the thread gnawed on itself, I moved through my house reclaiming space like an archaeologist who suddenly finds the floor plan makes sense again, clearing the last of Dylan's cable spaghetti from behind the television, laundering guest linens that smelled faintly of coconut sunscreen and procrastination, and gathering the stack of envelopes that had begun arriving addressed to them from banks, subscriptions, and a boutique gym that had definitely not seen their faces in months. After which I drove to the post office and filed the change of address forms that should have been theirs to file, not because I am petty, but because clarity is less negotiable than people think. On the way back, I stopped by the building office and removed their names from the parking permit list to end the weekly guessing game about whose car was banished to the curb. Cancelled the authorized user card Ashley had once claimed she needed only for emergencies that suspiciously resembled retail therapy, and switched every account linked to my address back to single occupancy. A tidy act of administrative revenge that felt less like punishment and more like housekeeping, although I would be lying if I said the small chime of each confirmation email did not deliver a satisfying little thud of dignity, and after that I placed a call to my insurance agent, a woman with an iron voice who said, of course, let us remove the additional adults from the household profile to reflect reality, and I pictured the spreadsheet cells updating themselves like tiny windows closing against a draft. By late afternoon, the extended family thread had done what it always does when met with documents instead of drama, which is to drift toward recipes and photos of decorated mantels. And I stood at the kitchen island with a bowl of soup and let the quiet expand, noticing how it did not accuse me, how it did not ask me to explain why boundaries hurt feelings, how it simply existed like a clean countertop waiting for whatever I might cook next, and then, because revenge should be useful when Possible. I drafted a polite email to my accountant asking her to prepare a tidy invoice for use and occupancy at fair market value retroactive to last spring, to be issued only if lines were crossed. Not because I want money from my sister, but because sometimes consequences should be visible on paper even if you never lick the envelope. The second evening brought fewer calls and more texts, shorter now, clipped, as if indignation had run its first sprint and was wheezing on the curb, and then a message from Dylan asking if I had at least packed the important stuff, by which he meant gaming consoles and a stack of limited edition sneakers, which I had, labeled and insured, because spite is loud but competence is final, and around midnight, when the neighborhood went to sleep and the winter air pressed its palm against the windows, my phone rang with my father's name, and I let it roll to voicemail not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. Then I set the phone face down and breathed through the old reflex that tells daughters to smooth over adult messes because someone else might be upset, and I went to bed on sheets that smelled like detergent and the absence of arguments. Morning brought sunlight that walked slowly across the floor like a guest who finally knows where to sit, and over coffee I pressed play on my father's message, expecting a measured lecture about family and optics and generosity, but what arrived was something different. A voice pitched lower, careful, as if he had padded down the hallway at night to phone from the garage, saying that he understood I needed space, that the situation had gone further than he meant it to, that he respected my right to protect my home, and then, after a pause long enough to pick up and weigh, he said there was something about the house I might not know, that there were details from years ago. Paperwork and a letter from Grandma Ruth in a safe deposit box that could complicate what I believed was straightforward, and that he wanted to explain before anyone else did, and as the message ended with a gentle, "Call me when you're ready," I stood in my kitchen with steam rising from my mug and felt the floor tilt in that sickening slow way it does when you realize the plot you thought you wrapped may have a hidden chapter, and I set the phone down very carefully, because the only sound louder than a slammed door is the one that opens onto a hallway you did not know existed. I met my father at the bank because if a conversation is going to bruise old scars, it helps to have carpeted hallways and fluorescent lighting to remind everyone that paperwork, not sentiment, decides what survives. And he walked beside me with the careful politeness of a man approaching an apology he has rehearsed, but not yet earned, leading me to a small private room where a clerk delivered a narrow metal box and withdrew with the speed of someone who has witnessed families rearrange themselves over signatures, and when the lid opened it was not a grenade or a deed with my name misspelled, but a folded letter in my grandmother Ruth's hand, the slanted neatness of a woman who baked exact pies and spoke in purposeful sentences, along with a thin sheaf of trust statements that looked ordinary until you noticed how the numbers tilted toward one daughter far more often than the other. The letter did not perform. It did not scold or take sides or list grievances like beads on a rosary. It simply said that when she gave me the down payment gift she did it because I had asked for stability rather than for an advancement on a future I kept promising would arrive. That she named my father as trustee for a small housing fund intended for both daughters with the strict instruction that the money never be used to enable laziness or vanity, and that if Ashley ever needed a roof it should be a roof with rules rather than a free-floating hammock of excuses, and as I read, the trust statements turned from neutral to indictment, not because they showed some elaborate theft, but because they revealed a series of temporary helps that had gathered into a quiet mountain on Ashley's side, airline rescues and deposit bailouts, and the kind of boutique emergencies that live on credit cards until a parent who hates conflict pretends they are medical. My father fixed his gaze on the grain of the table the way men look at something that will not shame them back, and he admitted that after Grandma died, he had treated the fund like a soft landing for whichever crisis was loudest. That when Ashley's landlord asked for a surprise security deposit, he had authorized it because the alternative was her moving in with strangers. That when she torched her credit chasing an online business course, he had used the fund to wipe the most predatory interest clean, and that when she and Dylan announced a break to reset, he had asked me to host them because the fund was thinner than anyone knew and he could not face telling his favorite daughter there was no more cushion, and he said favorite, and flinched as if the word had jumped from his mouth without permission, And then he said it again, slower, as if trying to move it from the throat to the lungs where it might transform into breath. The letter complicated nothing about the title to my house, which remains mine in ink and in practice, but it complicated everything about the story. I had told myself to stay angry without interruption. Because anger is easier when the villain wears a cape and not a cardigan, and I sat there, the metal box between us, and felt the shape of our family tilt toward honesty for the first time in years. And then my father did the one brave thing I have watched him avoid since elementary school choir. Recitals where he clapped offbeat to avoid being noticed. He said he would send an accounting to the entire family thread, not to humiliate Ashley, but to stop the whispered math that always makes the wrong person look extravagant. And he asked if I wanted him to keep the letter or if I would take it, and I said I would hold it for a while because sometimes the person who paid the most should get to carry the receipt. On the sidewalk outside, we were ambushed by timing, which is how families prefer to fight, with Ashley and Dylan idling at the curb in a borrowed car, my mother in the passenger seat gripping her phone like a protest sign. And they tumbled out with the exhausting choreography of people who believe scenes generate facts, demanding explanations for the bank, the secrecy, the narrative I was pushing as if journals had reporters embedded in my kitchen. And I felt the hot flare of an old habit. Justify, mitigate, compromise, but the letter in my bag was a cool stone and I held on to it. Then I told them calmly that there was a trust, that distributions had favored them for years, that Grandma's instructions had been explicit about roofs and rules, and that the last of that fund was gone because adults who confuse emergencies with disappointments tend to spend like arsonists and call the flames unfair weather. My mother tried to pivot to feelings, a field where numbers politely lose, and Ashley performed a quiver of hurt at being exposed, and Dylan muttered about legalities in the loose way of a man who treats citations like confetti. And I said no one was being exposed, that light is not exposure when it lands on facts, and then I did the kind of revenge that doesn't trend because it refuses to be loud. I tapped out a new message to the family thread attaching the scanned letter and a plain spreadsheet my accountant had drafted that morning in anticipation of denial, a 2-column ledger with dates and amounts and memo lines that read like a quiet biography, and I added a single sentence that tasted like clean water after a long road trip. That going forward any assistance to any adult would be contingent on written plans with outcomes instead of vibes, and that I was done underwriting stories that failed the arithmetic test. They watched the read receipts march across their screens like a slow wave meeting a seawall, and Ashley lunged for high ground, saying Grandma loved us both equally and that love should not be audited, which is a beautiful sentence and a terrible budget. And my father surprised all of us by saying that love does not fear records, that love is often the one demanding them so it can stand taller than rumor, and for a fragment of a second I saw the man he could have been if he had not spent 30 years playing moderator to a family that insists the loudest person is the most fragile, and in that second I decided on the day's final act, not because it was cruel, but because it was instructive. I told Ashley I had taken the liberty, while she was in Hawaii practicing selective inclusion, of calling the charity where Grandma volunteered every Tuesday of her last decade. A housing nonprofit that pairs women in transition with short-term furnished apartments under firm agreements, and that in Grandma's name I had funded, out of my own pocket. A 3-month placement for a mother and daughter who needed exactly the kind of help Ashley had been given without signatures, and that the placement began today in the very unit Ashley had hoped to claim if her campaign to re-enter my house succeeded, and the silence that followed was not theatrical. It was the kind that arrives when someone finally understands the joke at the exact moment they realize they are not the hero. And as Dylan stared at the asphalt, and my mother blinked like a stage light failing, I felt the weight of the letter in my bag and knew that revenge, properly matched to legacy, can be both a boundary and a mirror. And as I turned to go, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number that previewed only a courthouse address and a time next Wednesday, a hint of someone else's next move dressed as justice. The courthouse notice turned out not to be a summons to battle, but an invitation to perform, a mediation appointment wrapped in neutral phrasing that promised resolution pathways and restored harmony. which made me laugh in the car because nothing says harmony like a metal detector and a vending machine that eats your last coins. And I walked into the room carrying the kind of luggage that cannot be weighed on a scale, the deed with its stubborn ink, the month-to-month agreement that aged like a fine boundary, the scanned letter from Grandma Ruth that smelled of lemon cleaner and intention, a modest spreadsheet that could teach a course titled Consequences for Adults, and a new calm that arrived after I stopped auditioning for the role of reasonable daughter in a production directed by people who prefer chaos dressed as tradition. Ashley sat across the table in a blazer that had ideas about authority, Dylan beside her with a folder so thin it could have been a menu, my mother already brimming with heartfelt openings, and my father quieter than I had ever seen him. His hands folded on a legal pad he might actually use, while the mediator, a woman with a librarian's patience and a referee's gaze, explained that today was for agreements, not verdicts, that feelings would be acknowledged and facts would anchor us, and then she asked me to speak first, because the person who changed the locks usually gets cast as the antagonist, and antagonists, when given the floor, either melt down or build a stage, and I was there to build. I laid out the timeline without embroidery, describing the year of rent-free living, the utilities that thought they were feeding a small hotel, the groceries that vanished like ambitious ideas in group projects, the signed agreement that outlined grace and exit. The trip to Hawaii, which I now said aloud without flinching because the word no longer pressed on my chest, the decision to pack their belongings with care and store them like a grown person does when choosing order over spectacle, and then I described my silence as a tool rather than a tantrum, after which I presented copies of everything so no one needed to take my word for it when paper would do. And the mediator nodded in the way professionals nod when they recognize architecture where they expected debris. Ashley launched into a speech about family love without ledgers, about holidays and inclusions and my alleged deep-down jealousy, and there was a moment where her voice trembled just enough to rattle the blinds, but the mediator, who has definitely seen opera in these rooms, steered us back to measurable items, asking what outcomes each party wanted by the end of the hour, and Dylan asked for re-entry to the house under clarified expectations, which felt like an attempt to rebrand history. My mother asked for a pause on public family messages because reputations bruise easily in group threads. My father asked for an agreement we would all sign so he could stop carrying secrets like hot coals, and I said I wanted precisely two things, both boring and therefore powerful: a no-contact window to let the temperature drop, and a written acknowledgement from Ashley and Dylan that they had no tenancy, no claim, and no expectation of future housing without formal rent, plus a promise to collect their storage unit by the date already marked in ink. The mediator wrote, the room breathed, and then I offered something that tasted like revenge only if you had never tried accountability, which is to say it tasted clean, in exchange for the signed acknowledgments and the no-contact window. I would not pursue retroactive fair market invoices, and I would extend my donation in Grandma's name to the housing nonprofit for another quarter, on the condition that Ashley spend 2 evenings a week volunteering there until spring, because if she wanted to talk about family love without ledgers, she could demonstrate it for strangers who cannot afford the luxury of speeches, and my mother started to protest that I was humiliating her older child. But the mediator held up a hand and asked Ashley whether contributing where help is real felt like punishment or perspective, and my sister, to her credit, did not answer immediately, which in our family counts as growth. The agreement formed itself on the printer like a bridge appearing stone by stone, signatures arriving in slow, reluctant ink, Dylan pressing so hard his name left a grove, my father writing with an unshaking hand that told me more than his speeches ever had. And when it was my turn, I signed without fanfare and slid the pages back, and the mediator collected them like a teacher retrieving quizzes, then said something about compliance and check-ins and the miracle of small honest steps, and the room exhaled into a hushed clatter as chairs moved, and I felt the peculiar weightlessness that follows a landing you doubted you would stick. Outside, winter light made the cars look freshly minted, and my mother hovered with the old ache in her eyes, asking if we were truly doing no contact, even for holidays, and I said holidays are not holy when they require a sacrificial daughter. And for once she did not correct the metaphor. She simply nodded and stepped back, while my father pulled a small envelope from his coat, the original of Grandma's letter that he wanted me to keep permanently, saying that legacies do not live in safes. They live where decisions are made, and then he asked if I might call him in a week, not to report or negotiate, just to talk about recipes and the dog, and the way the neighborhood goes quiet after the first snow, and I said maybe. Which in my mouth is more generous than any promise I have ever broken to keep a family peace. I drove home through streets blinking with reluctant decorations and unlocked my own front door with keys that no longer felt like a question mark, set the signed agreement in the drawer beside batteries and flashlights, and walked room to room in a slow inventory of ordinary blessings, the hum of the heater, the slow parade of afternoon light, the absolute scandal of a couch you do not have to share with someone live streaming his opinions. Then brewed coffee and opened the email from the nonprofit director who wanted to confirm Ashley's volunteer schedule, a polite message that read like the first page of a new calendar, and while the kettle clicked and the house exhaled, my phone lit with a voicemail from an unknown number that I knew in my bones was Ashley, because hurt people love burner phones, and I watched the screen until it went dark, set the phone face down with a tenderness I usually reserve for breakable things, and stood very still in the kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum like a faithful choir, deciding whether the final act of revenge would be calling back at last or keeping the soft, brutal promise of silence, my thumb hovering over a decision that could mean reconciliation, relapse, or something braver than either, and I let the moment lengthen like a held note, because sometimes the most honest ending is the one that refuses to tell you if it is an ending at all.